back to my workshop. It's a freezing cold day in January, but somehow work has to carry on. I spend the majority of my time working as a wheelwright. That means I make carriage wheels. And yet, with the exception of a few videos I made right at the very start, in fact the very first videos I made were carriage wheels, I've never actually made any videos about doing it ever since. And yet it makes up the majority of my work. I suppose I think for the majority of people it's not going to be that interesting, because all I'm doing is I'm making wheels. The only difference is that sometimes they're big wheels and sometimes they're little wheels. But they're still round and they've still got spokes, and for me they're the same. But I still enjoy making them, so I won't knock it. But it so happens on this occasion somebody's asked me to make a wheelbarrow wheel. Now wheelbarrow wheels are slightly unusual for me. I don't make very many of them. So what I thought I would do is, whilst I was making their wheel, I'd make a second one because it's easy to make things in batches. And I'd also make a video about it. Don't know if you feel the urge to make a wheelbarrow wheel. They're probably the most difficult wheels to make, so you're probably not going to want to make them. But never mind, I'll show you how to do it anyway. So the wheel I'm going to make is going to be a 16-inch wheel. That means it's 16 inches across. It's going to have 8 spokes, and it's also going to be dead flat, so it's going to go straight up and down. And that's quite unusual, but I'll bore you about that bit in a minute. So our first job is we need to make the hub, sometimes called the nave. And here's one I made earlier, so we just need to make another one of those. Starting with a block of wood like that. And then after I've done that, I need to make some spokes, coming from a block of wood like that. When I'm doing bigger wheels, normally when you make a spoke, you do it with a draw knife or a spoke shave or a combination of the two. But when you're doing spokes as little as this, it's very hard to actually do it with a spoke shave because you haven't got enough room to do anything. So what I've done with these, and this is one of a number I made earlier today, is I've done them on the lathe. And I must say it works rather well. I quite like this. I carefully measured the circumference of the hub just to make sure I can get 8 on. But that's going to look rather nice. I think that's going to look quite smart. I rather like that. So anyway, we'll go to the lathe and we'll start turning. I do get asked how accurate I have to work to. And the important bit is I need to get this diameter here. This needs to be exactly the same on that one. Everything else, if it's a millimetre out, no one's going to notice. But the important bit is I need to get that diameter exactly the same. So I shall use a pair of calipers as I go. I won't bore you and make you sit through it all, but we'll see how we get on. Well, that's pretty close, so we can start to mark this out. If we hold our other piece up against it, look at that, it's almost the same, isn't it? So I'll now go away and do exactly the same thing on this end, but that's not so easy for you to see. So go and have a cup of tea, I'll see you in a moment. Now when you do a quantity of these, you get much better at it. So I timed this earlier and I've got this down to 3 minutes a spoke. Well, that's not bad. I've probably done that in slightly under 3 minutes. That needs a bit more sanding, but for all intents and purposes, that's done. If you look carefully, and I'm not going to encourage you to do this too much, but the differences, and there are only minor differences between them, but they're exactly the same. each hub. So obviously I'm stronger on the left hand as I am with the right. I'm sure if you're a psychologist or something, you'd have a lot to say on the subject. But anyway, we move on. So as you can see, I've now mortised this all the way through. I've got 8 holes. Somebody asked me the other day, why do I use a drill press mortiser rather than the proper mortising machine? And the answer is, I mean, these are tiny little hubs. This is 2.5 inches across. In my world, that's really, really small. Sometimes I'll be doing hubs that big. If I'm doing it on a mortising machine, you can't get, or it's very hard to get a mortising machine with that much throat capacity. 12, 14 inches, they just don't exist. So whilst a proper mortising machine would probably be better, it wouldn't give me the capacity. And I'm not cutting big mortises, I'm just cutting a lot of them. So this is a nice easy way of doing it. The jig itself is something, as you can see, I made years ago, and I've got a variety of plates that I've made up here, and I just choose the one depending on how many holes I want to mortise. So there you go. We'll leave that to cool down for a little bit, because that's still a little on the warm side. I might just go and dip it in some water just to shrink it that last little bit, and then we'll do the other one. What I've fitted now is a metal sleeve on the inside of that. If you were doing a proper carriage wheel, you'd have what's called a boxing, which is a metal sleeve but with some edges. And a boxing is a sort of a tapered sleeve, so that fits onto the axle. In this particular instance, we don't have a right or a wrong side, so it's a parallel sleeve. It's just a piece of metal tube I've put in there. Most wooden wheelbarrow wheels don't have this kind of sleeve. They would just have a hole in the wood, and it would go around on a metal axle, working on the theory that it's never going to go very far, so they probably wouldn't bother with the sleeve. But by the time it's worn the hole too big, it's 20 years later and no one really cares. However, if a job's worth doing, it's worth doing properly. Well, when you see it like that, it seems like an awful lot of hard work for a very small wheel. There's nothing to it. I knew there was a reason I wasn't keen on wheelbarrow wheels. Well, you can see where I'm coming from now. This is not going to be an enormous wheel, but it's still going to be quite nice. The largest wheel I ever made was a 2 metre wheel. I mean, that was an absolute brute of a wheel. I was just about able to get it through the workshop door. The largest wheel I've ever come across was some friends of mine in Canada, and they made a 7 metre wheel. And that was a mining wheel to go at the top of sort of the mine shaft. Meant for a Steven Spielberg film. But we'll concentrate on the modest size ones for now. Well, we've reached a point. We now have the spokes in. As you can see, they're completely flat, which is quite unusual. Most of the wheels I make have what they call dish, which is this sort of comes in and comes out at an angle. And there's all kinds of good reasons for that. So now we're ready to make the wooden rims. The proper term for the wooden rim is called fellies. It's spelt fellows, but it's pronounced fellies. So we need to make a variety of these. Now this is going to be an English pattern. So that means we're going to make these rims in sections to go over 2 spokes. So obviously I've got 8 spokes here, I'm going to need 4. I've got 2 of them, I'm going to need 8 in total. So I've got myself a rather nice plank of ash. I'll put it through the thicknesser. So this is now down to 30mm, and I've made a pattern. This is the bit you really need to spend some time on. Get this absolutely correct, because if you don't get this bit right, you screw everything. We're putting it on here and then cutting it out on the band side. And this is the first part. So this is with all the tenons cut, and then when we hold our bit of felly up against it, you see it fits exactly, which is pretty much what we want. So now we're going to start fitting the fellies. Now this is where you start to see the problems with working on small wheels. They're drilled so they fit beautifully when they're up against there. But when you try and get them on like this, I'm working on the bigger wheel, the spokes are much longer, so they're much easier to pull around. So what I've got to do is hope that I can bend without breaking the spoke. Well, I'm delighted to say that went on a little bit easier than I was anticipating. I must be getting good at this. There you are, for all intents and purposes, that's the woodwork done. That's not bad. You can still see little tiny gaps, but ideally the gaps here match the gaps on here, and then when we put the tyre on, that will shrink it all together. Now this is probably my oldest piece of machinery. I hate to think how old it is, but it certainly goes back to the 1800s. And so I put a strip of steel into it. In this case it's 30mm wide by 6mm deep. And I'm just rolling it into a circle. But this is what's going to form the tyre for our wheelbarrow wheel. So all the woodwork is done. So now what we need to do is to measure the outside and then transfer that measurement over to the tyre that we made. So we use this tool here, which is called a traveller, and think of it as a circular tape measure. Now in the old days, the blacksmith would you have to do this in the fire, and you'd fire weld it. I reckon it'd be alright doing fire welding. I'm pretty good at it. But I don't think I could do this with the level of accuracy that's required. They must have been very good blacksmiths in those days. So we do it the easy way. So now we get to the fun part. This is where we're going to make the tyre, this bit here, fit over the top of the wheel. At the moment, it won't fit. It's close, but it won't fit. So what we need to do is to warm it up in a fire. That will make it slightly malleable. It will also expand the tyre so it becomes slightly bigger. And on a tyre that sort of size, we're going to get about 1 centimetre's expansion. That's sufficient to put it over the top of the wheel, bang it down into place, and then we'll shrink it down with water, and that will hold it all together, and then that's the wheel done. Marvellous, I hear you cry. Now normally I'd do this on a much bigger scale. I've got a proper fire pit, and I'd be holding the wheel down on a proper steel plate, which I have down at the fire pit, but frankly this wheel is so small it would fall through the centre of the steel plate. So I'm taking advantage of this old pallet I've got lying around, and I've made a little plate there that's holding it in place. So all we've got to do now is heat up the tyre. There you are, that's the tyre fitted, and that's nice and tight. That's not coming off anywhere anytime soon. And you can hear that that's pretty well fitted. Now we're going to leave that to dry for a little while, and then we're ready to start finishing this off. Well, for all intents and purposes, that's the end of the process. We've ended up with 2 decent wheelbarrow wheels. Yep, I quite like those. They need a bit of sanding down, a little bit of finishing, but for all intents and purposes, as far as we're concerned, they're done. Now, one of them I'm going to sand down and finish in varnish, and the other one I'm going to paint, and I'm going to do some pinstriping on it. Be quite interested to see how I get on with that, but that's something for another day. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, go and have a look at some of the other videos on my channel. You never know, you might enjoy those as well. There's always the danger. So I'm going to get round to finishing these off. In the meantime, thanks for watching. I'll see you soon. Bye bye.